Ocean estimates that it accounts for 50 to 70% of the global squid catch in international waters, 50 to 70%. Much of that, what we saw off the Galapagos Islands, was not the I in IUU. It wasn't necessarily illegal, but it was likely unauthorized and certainly not sustainable. So the Chinese fishing fleet, as well as other distant water fishing nations that are fishing outside of their own EEZs, are really pushing the edges of the U's, as well as crossing into the I of illegal and illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. So this panel is going to highlight the footprint and the impact of the Chinese distant water fleet and that nexus of illegal fishing and human rights abuses at sea. So without more of me, let me just talk about some logistics of how this is going to work. Our panelists will all give you presentations, and at the end, we'll have a moderated Q&A section. So as you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat box, and we'll have some discussion at the end with our panelists. So now on to introductions of our panel. First is Philip Cho. He's Senior Advisor at Oceana. He has extensive experience working on international environmental campaigns, shaping conservation policy, and providing analysis on China affairs. He has previously worked at Conservation International, CWEB, and the Pew Charitable Trust. Next up will be Tabitha Mallory. She is the founder of the consulting firm China Ocean Institute and affiliate professor at the University of Washington Jackson School of International Studies. She conducts research on Chinese ocean and fisheries policy using Chinese language sources. And finally, our panel will wrap up with Ian Urbina. He's an investigative reporter writing for outlets such as the New York Times, The Atlantic, and The New Yorker. You all already likely know or have heard about Ian as author of the New York Times bestseller, The Outlaw Ocean, which was based on more than 5 years of reporting, much of it offshore, exploring lawlessness on the high seas. And if you haven't read his book yet, I suggest you order it because he really illustrates these complex issues in an approachable but suspenseful way. And to top it off, he has won a Pulitzer Prize, a George Polk Award, and I'm confident to say he's the only panelist that's been nominated for an Emmy, though if Tabitha and Philip want to surprise us, they can share their Emmy nominations as well. So without further ado, let me pass it on to my esteemed panelists to kick off the discussion. And again, as you have questions, put them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end. So Philip, on to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad you're here on this dreary, drizzly Friday, Washington morning. So let me share my screen and let's get going. Please let me know, Beth, once we see the screen. We're good to go?
I see him and we're good to go.
All right, excellent. So massive industrial fishing fleets are applying the waters of developing countries in the high seas. And these so-called distant water fleets come from many nations. But China is the largest one, making up 40% of global catch effort, and followed by some other countries and nations such as Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and Spain. Pictured here, you see thousands of Chinese vessels from Zhejiang province heading out to sea. So, disturbingly, these distant water fishing vessels are frequently found guilty of infractions, crimes like labor abuses, illegal fishing, and shark finning, and frequently associated with some other serious crimes, including drug trafficking, murder, slavery, bribery, and money laundering. According to the global ratings of the Illegal Fishing Index, the IUU Fishing Index, China is the worst performer of these countries. In this picture, you see a Senegalese naval officer preparing to board a ship suspected of illegal fishing. And I know this was a ship, U.S. Coast Guard supported intervention through a shipwrighter program. So to make matters worse, the vast removal of fish by distant water fleets is often hitting the world's most vulnerable communities, such as those in West Africa and Southeast Asia. Those people depend on fish for survival in the forms of jobs and meals. So this is critical business. Approximately 120 million full-time and part-time workers globally are directly dependent on commercial capture fisheries. And 97% of these people live in developing countries. Here are a couple women unloading fish in the Gambia, where fish makes up to 50% of their protein intake and provide jobs such as processing and fish selling, which are mostly done by women. And approximately 30% of China's fleet is fishing in African waters, 30%. So let me provide you some key stats that make that show how China is the world's biggest fishing actor and that play a role in making them a leading perpetrator in IUU, unsustainable, and unequitable fishing. I'll let you read for yourself here, but looking at the vessel numbers, you can see this vessel numbers, if you compare that to either the EU or US fleet of around 250 to 300 distant water fishing vessels, you can see sort of the scale of difference. Here we can see that China's fishing covers a vast amount of the globe with greater reach than any other distant water fishing nations. And finally, the number of distant water fishing enterprises has proliferated over the last decade, ranging from small and medium enterprises to national level conglomerates. So this makes for a really challenging fishing management environment. The majority of Chinese distant water fishing enterprises would likely be unsustainable if it weren't for the government's subsidies that are being provided, as you see in the bottom bullet. Here's an image of where China fishes around the world, and this is just during a 6-month period. We took May through November 2019. These brightly lit areas represent its fishing activity tracked by satellite. As you can see, moving left to right, in the Pacific, we have vessels fishing for tuna off of Peru and Ecuador, and the Galapagos, as mentioned by Beth. There's fishing for squid and mackerel. Moving over to the right off of Argentina for squid, along the west and east coast of Africa for sardinella and other forage fish, and throughout Southeast Asia, there's fishing, and also even a growing presence off of Antarctica for toothfish and krill. So, pardon me, many vital aspects of China's distant water fishing operations are opaque, and that applies to subsidies, the fishing access agreements, beneficial ownership, labor conditions, fishing violations, fishing militia, and even official development assistance funding. Here, regarding one-sided access agreements, China or Chinese entities cut deals with nation states to fish in their waters, but these terms are usually never made public. Sometimes associated with these deals are Chinese fishing that hides in the EEZs of other countries by establishing international joint ventures or shell companies or chartering and beneficial ownership schemes. It makes it look like these Chinese vessels are actually counted as those domestic vessels in that country. And through these one-sided agreements, China often gains political and economic leverage, including by providing infrastructure as a form of payments for fishing access. Talking about flags of convenience here, this is usually a duplicitous practice. Vessels from one country are registered under a flag of convenience of another country to escape oversight and regulations in the owner's country or to reduce costs. In the past, Panama was one of the most notorious flags of convenience and operated an open registry for those wishing to purchase the Panamanian flag to operate under lax regulations. Additionally, flags of convenience obscure global fish catch data and allow vessels that have violated regulations to continue to operate by what we call hopping flags. They continuously acquire new flags of convenience. So Chinese and other distant water fishing vessels have a record of operating under flags of convenience. Another duplicitous practice is for vessel owners to hide behind front or shell companies, as I mentioned already, to avoid responsibility, particularly for paying penalties or complying with sanctions. And here we see beneficial ownership scheme that was revealed in Ghana that shows the controlling ownership of the entire fleet of an entire fleet of Ghanaian vessels is actually Chinese. You can see the schematic on the right-hand side of your screen and the connections between the ownership. Here, another issue that we need to look at is Chinese vessels have routinely evaded monitoring by turning off their vessel monitoring systems and satellite locating devices, something called AIS, and also manipulating software to show multiple vessels broadcasting the same signal or also broadcasting false locations. Here in this picture, we show you that these red dots represent what's called transshipping, which is where a carrier vessel aggregates fish from other fishing vessels, and that's a major enabler of IUU fishing because it allows both legally and illegally caught fish to be mixed together and results in laundered fish arriving at landing ports. Another issue with transshipping is that it allows vessels to stay at sea almost indefinitely, making a rife environment for human rights and forced labor. Human rights abuses, and forced labor. Chinese fishing boats, particularly tuna longliners, have been known to target sharks for the lucrative shark fin trade and the expanding trade of other shark products, including meat, oils, skin, and cartilage. In 2017, pictured here, this Chinese vessel, the Fuyuan Yulong 999, was caught inside the Galapagos Marine Reserve with its satellite tracking system turned off and with more than 6,000 fin sharks, which is a clear violation of Ecuadorian law and international treaties. Looking at subsidies, in this bar graph, we see China's, on the left, you see China's fishing subsidies are about $6 billion US dollars, followed by the EU, the US, Korea, Japan, and Russia. And basically, these subsidies for China allow it to fish almost anywhere in the world, despite the fact that distant water fishing is mostly an unprofitable industry without fuel subsidies. Actually, without subsidies, a study a couple years ago estimated that 50% of all fishing on the high seas would be unprofitable. Another key area of transparency that we need to look at is China's Belton Road Initiative. As you're probably familiar, it's a massive $1 trillion trade initiative and extends into the global fishing sector. China is building a network of infrastructure for the flow of goods and resources in and out of China. We've seen the suspect examples of predatory lending here, where countries default on loans and Chinese entities take over projects, big projects such as seaports or rail lines, other infrastructure. Here in the picture is the port of Montevideo in Uruguay, and it's the site of a massive distant fishing water port that is being proposed to be built by Chinese investment to create a fully integrated hub for distant water fishing vessels. Essentially, you're creating a Chinese port outside of China, and the potential use of this facility to evade documentation of fish catch, evade taxes, and not to mention other nefarious dealings is potentially troubling. One more issue that we need to look at is forced labor. A large percentage of crew that work on distant water fishing vessels are deceived into working with the lure of high pay and adventurous opportunity. Tragically, most of these opportunities, or many of them, turn out to be dead bond labor schemes, with workers often working 18 plus hours a day and eventually of no pay, and in worst cases, abuse, torture, and even sometimes death at sea. Finally, the last issue that I want to put in front of you is this, what's called fishing militia. In the South China Sea and in some other areas, Chinese fishing vessels have been utilized to push China's territorial claims of traditional fishing rights across what's called the 9-dash line. It's this dotted red line you see in the U shape, which is in defiance of recognized exclusive economic zones of the international community and the neighboring countries. It's been observed that Chinese Coast Guard vessels have escorted Chinese fishing fleets into these EEZs of their neighboring countries. Occasionally, violent conflict has erupted out of this. So how do we address this and stop this catching a single violator or providing a one-time penalty is probably not enough to systematically change this egregious behavior. So, based on my observation, I think we really need to start with radical transparency. And so finally, I've just given you a last slide here to recap the issues where we really need to take a look at transparency. Here they are. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Philip. And now we'll hear from Tabitha.
Great. Thanks, Philip. And I want to thank the Senate Ocean Caucus for all the work that you do, to Jill for organizing this event, and to Beth for moderating. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see.
We see your slides, but it's not the presenter view.
Yeah, I'm trying to get it into presenter view.
Okay.
There we go.
Got it.
Okay. Yay. All right. So I'm going to talk about the steps that China is taking to address some of these problems, and then turn to some of the remaining problems, which include subsidies and some issues with trade and overseas investment. So in the past, starting from when the industry got underway in the mid-1980s, just until recently, China's policy on distant water fishing was just expansion. As many vessels as we can, as much cash as we can bring back. And in recent years, you've seen a more moderated approach in their policy, which is due to a lot of international pressure, media attention. A lot of Chinese point to the issue of the Argentine Coast Guard vessel sinking the Chinese fishing vessel in 2016 as very embarrassing for China. And so, they've been taking steps to address this, which shows that it's really important to put pressure, especially internationally, on China to work on some of these issues. So one of the things we've seen is a commitment to reduce fisheries subsidies. Following on that, they've worked to strengthen their observer program, put more observers on more vessels around the world. They created a distant water training and compliance center in Shanghai at Shanghai Ocean University to train the crew better. They've created changes in the 13 five-year plan, both the general one, and then there's also one specifically for distant water fishing where they're pledging to cap the number of vessels, but it doesn't go along with capping the capacity of the vessels. So we've seen that even though the vessel numbers aren't expanding as fast, the ships are still growing in size. They're being renovated. New constructed ships tend to be much larger, and that's still too much capacity. And then earlier this year, China issued new distant water fishing regulations, which were updated significantly for the first time since 2003. There have been a few minor updates in between, but they've included language on IUU fishing for the first time, which is a great development because the first step is recognizing that there is a problem. In the past, they just denied that the Chinese fleet were engaging in any IUU fishing. They've made it mandatory to report the formation of joint ventures or wholly owned enterprises, to report reflagging. There's language in there about port stakes measures. There's even language about vessels should be leaving a buffer zone outside the EEZs of other countries where they're not supposed to fish. So all of this is great, but it really remains to be seen, how it's going to be implemented and enforced. And then following on those regulations are a couple of new policies. One is the establishment of 2 high seas fishing moratoria for squid, both in the South Pacific and the South Atlantic. And to me, this just shows that if China is issuing moratoria on its own fleet on the high seas, the problem's got to be pretty bad. And then there are also high seas transshipment measures that require the fleet to report transshipments on the high seas starting in January 2021. But yeah, it'll be really key to see how much this is implemented and enforced moving forward. And one of the really big problems that, it's really an issue of policy coherence for the Chinese. So they're making all these commitments to be more sustainable, but at the same time, they've got, expansionary policies. And one of these is subsidies. So I'll talk about that next. And in my mind, I really see the Chinese as recognizing that there are problems and working to comply with the letter of the law, but not necessarily the spirit of the law. So it's not really full cooperation with the goal of sustainability. So Phil talked a little bit about fisheries subsidies, and out of the total global subsidies provided by all countries to fishing industries, China provides 21%. And then in terms of the harmful subsidies, which is things like fuel subsidies and vessel renovation and construction, China provides 27% of the global total. So it's a lot. And then over the years, the Chinese have been decreasing transparency in terms of reporting the amounts of subsidies that they're providing. So to illustrate this, I just have these pictures on both sides of the screen here. On the left side is, and the other issue with this too is they don't provide the subsidy information in tabular form, which would make it very easy for us to read. It's all in prose, so you have to go through and read it in Chinese and just pull out mentions of amounts for different programs. So in 2009, from the China Fisheries Yearbook, all the text that's on the left side of that page and then onto the right side. So like over, like half a page is their reporting of their various subsidies programs and the amounts. And then if you compare it to a more recent yearbook, the 2018 Fisheries Yearbook, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, indicated by the green bracket at the bottom, it's just like one little tiny paragraph. So there's just been a huge decrease in the amount that China is reporting. And this is just even to its own audience. And there's been a lot of problems with the reporting to the WTO and, just not comprehensive reporting. And just to kind of talk, since everyone's been talking about the Galapagos fleet a lot, I thought I'd say a little bit something about that, and as kind of a case study to show how much the subsidies really matter. So this is fishing activity by the Chinese fleet off the coast of the Galapagos for July and August. So each one of those pink dots is a fishing activity. And if you look at the vessels, there were about 340 or so from that time period. If you look at where the vessels are coming from, most of them are coming from Zhejiang province, which is the really big bubble. It's kind of, centrally located on the coast in China near Shanghai. And then the second largest group was Shandong with 65 of those vessels, and then Fujian province with 22 vessels. And there's, a scattering of other vessels from other provinces. And if you look at the catch and subsidies that those provinces land and receive, you really can see the connection. You can just really follow the money here. So in terms of catch, Zhejiang provides about a quarter of China's distant water catch, followed by second place Fujian province, and then Shandong in third place. So that those happen to be the top three provinces that catch the most. And then they are also the top three provinces that receive the most subsidies from the Chinese government. So on the right-hand side, Zhejiang, Shandong, and Fujian. So what we're seeing is the issuance of these Chinese policies that are really to bring back more of the distant water catch to China and provide a system to consolidate the supply chain system so that China can both capture more of the value added and bring more of their catch to China. So a lot of you probably heard of the Going Out policy, which was issued in 2001. It's to encourage Chinese companies to invest overseas and find new markets overseas. But now there's this counter policy, the coming back policy. And so the idea is, this is just the last few years. So the idea is that any kinds of overseas investments should be with an eye towards benefiting China and benefiting the domestic consumer market in China. And so in accordance with this, you've seen more of the distant water catch being sent home to China. So in 2018, China sent 65% of its catch home, and that's a jump from only about half, 49% in 2009. And then if you look at high seas fishing versus EEZ fishing, so there's pretty much two parts of the industry. One is on the high seas, which a lot of that is unregulated, and there's fishing in the exclusive economic zones of other countries, on the basis of bilateral fisheries agreements. And because the EEZ fishing is more regulated as countries figure out that this is not really sustainable for them, China is shifting more of its industry to the high seas to take advantage of the fact that it's unregulated. A lot of it is, at least. And so the catch in 2017 from the high seas is 66%, and that's a jump from only 43% coming from the high seas in 2010. And so to help with the infrastructure here, in those same three provinces, these largest fishing provinces, Zhejiang, Shandong, and Fujian, they're constructing national distant water fishing bases that have, docks for landing, processing facilities, storage facilities. Even, the Shandong one has a shipbuilding center that's associated with it. And they're planning on, when all of these are operational, they will have the capacity to have a throughput of catch of 3.8 million tons. And that's over twice the amount of the domestic landing for China's distant water catch, which was 1.32 million tons in 2019. So you can see that their goal is pretty big here to just really expand the industry and how much is coming back. A really important part of this, so I just want to turn to trade now. A really important part of this is China's seafood trade, and China imports 5.22 million tons of seafood in 2018 and exported 4.3 million tons. A lot of that we don't know at a granular level how much goes to the Chinese domestic market and how much ends up in the processing industry and then is re-exported. And so here's where the U.S. plays a pretty big role. There's an often-cited statistic that the U.S. imports 90% of its seafood, but studies show that it's actually probably only importing 62 to 65% of its seafood from foreign sources if you account for the amount of seafood that's being sent to China, like, pollock, for example, salmon for processing, and then that's re-imported. So what would be really helpful is to have labeling requirements that don't just include the country of consignment. So China will say, they'll import our pollock from the U.S. and add a certain number, certain amount of processing, so it's a certain amount of value added, and then they'll label it as a product of China when it's re-exported to the United States. So really having the country of origin and the country of consignment, like the country that did the processing, would be really helpful for this. And so here's another illustration of why this matters. So, we're thinking about, if we think back to the fleet that's fishing off the coast of the Galapagos, they're now down by Peru. If we look at Chinese imports of squid from 2012 to 2016, essentially what's happening is they used to import so much of their squid from Peru and Argentina, and then, in those last, at least the last year for Peru and the last couple of years for Argentina, those imports have dropped off a lot. And that's around the time when China began to send a lot of its fleet to those areas to fish. So essentially they're catching the squid themselves, and they're not buying it anymore from Peru or Argentina. And so what this means for the United States, we import a lot of our squid from China. And so here's our imports of squid from China for 2017 and 2018. And we do not have an understanding of where the squid comes from, or even a breakdown of the individual species of the squid. So there's only 2 different species that we actually keep track of. And then, there's the other 2 groupings on the bottom indicated by that green bracket. Within that, there's about 30 to 40 species of squid that we're just not keeping track of. We don't even know where it comes from. So traceability is really important because we don't want to be feeding into this, this unsustainable fishing. And then in terms of distant water fishing overseas investment to prop up this infrastructure to, improve the supply chain so that China can import the fish back home better, they're creating a lot of subsidiaries abroad, distant water fishing bases. And there's not a lot that's understood about all of this. So this really, deserves more research. So China had almost 200 overseas distant water fishing subsidiaries. Half of those are in Africa, and there's a bunch in Asia, some in South America, Europe, North America. And then there are also overseas distant water fishing bases that are being built, to provide not only support for the fleet that's, out at sea in terms of, bunkering and food supplies and all that kind of stuff, but also to, provide processing and, other kind of onshore supplies and facilities. And this is an older figure, but they have plans to expand this a lot more. But we do know from a report in 2014 that the Chinese issued that they've built 34 already, and then 24 of them had received investment of about $2 million each. So that's a total of about $280 million. And then another issue is China is starting to acquire seafood companies abroad in order to get access to, their ships, their quotas. And this is just a couple of examples, and this is also an area that's not very well understood or studied. Also from a few years back, 2014, there was a Shanghai company that bought an Argentine fishing company for $21.5 million and then accessed their shrimp ships, squid, cod ships, and fishing license. It gave them access to about 10,000 tons of pelagic resources per year. And then there's another example of a Dalian company buying a share that used to belong to Spain of another Argentine company to get access to their shrimp and squid vessels. So for the Belton Road Initiative, which Philip had talked about a little bit, so this is a map of the ports that the Chinese are building around the world and the ones that they've invested in. So this is not just the fishing bases, but it gives you, there's over 80 of them, and it gives you an indication of, how expansive China's footprint is in ports around the world. And like I said before, we don't really have a great understanding of, which ones of these are the fish bases. But I was in China last year. I visited that fishing base in the national fishing base in Zhejiang province and just took some photos of some of the maps. And so this is, just this one province, Zhejiang, this is where their fleet is going around the world. And then in a couple other photos, they had a map of the distant water fishing bases that they had established overseas. So these are in Papua New Guinea, Peru, Panama, off the coast of Africa. There's one in Iran, Seychelles Islands, Angola, Mauritius. And so this is just, one company in Zhejiang and the overseas bases that they are establishing. So this is just something that, we should really be paying attention to and understand the financing here better. And, there's some security implications for setting up these bases because, I saw in a company report for a Chinese distant water fishing company that the distant water fishing industry could be seen as China's second Navy. And so, the risk here is that, in the case of some kind of conflict, China could maybe use some of these bases as support for military activities. And we just don't really understand the connection between those two. So I will stop there and look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Tabitha. And now on to Ian.
That was fascinating. First of all, thanks for having me. My intention was just perhaps to talk a little bit about one story in particular, which is a sort of subset narrative to the larger China maritime play story. Just by way of introduction, for 20 years was at the Times and now run a nonprofit that is called Outlaw Ocean Project that focuses on producing these sorts of stories, often with help from the likes of Tabitha and Philip and Beth. And this particular piece ran about a month and a half ago with NBC News and then a bunch of venues after that. And at root, this was a story that sought to build in collaboration with an international team of academics who for quite a while had been working with an organization called Global Fishing Watch to solve a couple of vexing challenges. One was to sort of corroborate something that had been well known anecdotally in the East Sea or Sea of Japan for a while, which was that huge numbers of Chinese vessels were routinely crossing those waters and for a long while legally doing so, entering North Korean waters. But post-2017, after nuclear testing, UN sanctions were imposed. Foreign fishing in North Korean waters was forbidden. China signed on to those sanctions. And after that date, the presence of Chinese vessels in North Korean waters became clearly illegal. Most of the vessels that were then still going to North Korean waters were doing so under radar, if you will, metaphorically, turning off their transponders And there were a lot of reports bubbling up from local South Korean fishermen, as well as anonymous, most likely South Korean and Japanese, tips being provided to the UN about the number of Chinese vessels that were crossing South Korean waters and entering North Korean waters to fish. So what we wanted to do, we being these academics, Global Fishing Watch and my team, was number one, rely on Global Fishing Watch and their expertise to see if there's a way to cleverly use a variety of different satellite technology to lay eyes on, so to speak, the dots on the map and get some quantitative sense of that Chinese presence in North Korean waters. Global Fishing Watch and these academics were able to sort of crack the code on that using a couple different tactics, and they were able to sort of figure out that indeed it was quite a sizable force, some years above 800 vessels, all Squid vessels that were entering and fishing in North Korean waters. Then my team, I'm a journalist, not an academic, and so my sort of goal was to sort of make this narrative, translate the research into layman's terms that would resonate with the public, and also to actually go out on the water and document the actual reality of these ships entering North Korean waters. I was personally, and my team, we were personally motivated by two sort of particular mysteries. One was the sort of going wisdom and likely true, likely correct about a certain statistical drop-off in the squid stock in this body of water that had been occurring, roughly a decade. And there are various, causal factors there. But the thought was that the industrial fleet that was present there was contributing to an acceleration of the overfishing of those waters and accelerating the 70–80% decline in squid stock in those waters. And so we wanted to sort of see if, aside from climate change and other factors, whether the fleet was large enough that it could be helping that decline. And then there's this other sort of somewhat gruesome mystery about these dead bodies that were routinely washing up on the coast of Japan. These were typically North Korean smaller vessels, 5–6-man boats, sort of non-industrial, low-tech, rickety boats that were washing ashore in Japan, and in sizable enough numbers that there was this question as to why. Again, the going wisdom, and probably partially correct, was that maybe because of the sanctions or worsened by the sanctions, or maybe otherwise, the North Korean government was applying pressure to the fishing sector and sort of pushing fishermen to bring in more fish to feed the North Korean population. And those pressures were translating into fishermen taking risks, going out further to sea, staying out longer, pushing rickety boats. There was also a transition of soldiers onto boats, and they were less skilled. But that might be why these boats were ending up getting stuck out there, and folks were capsizing or not able to get back to shore, and then were dying and washing up in Japan. Our interest was maybe there's also reason to believe that the presence of this huge invisible Chinese fleet might be worsening those factors as well, and potentially contributing to these so-called ghost boats that were washing ashore. We went to South Korea, got on a Squid vessel, headed out to coordinates that we thought was the likely throughway for the Chinese Squid boats. Indeed, there they were, sort of making their way to North Korean waters, flying Chinese flags. All of them had their transponders turned off, except the lead boat, which usually had it turned on. And then in multiple occasions, one boat would be followed by 10 to 12 other boats, all identical, some of them bearing the same name, and kind of making their way into North Korean waters. Eventually, we pulled off because the lead boat that we were trailing, and we put a drone over, conveyed in clear terms that they were not happy we were following them, and sort of turned towards us and made some aggressive gestures. So our captain decided it was time to back off. But this story was just one of the types of stories that builds on the research that Tabitha and Philip are doing, and sort of is taking a look at how this distant water fishing fleet operates, and some of the challenges that I think Tabitha rightly pointed out of, while on the one hand, it does seem like the rhetoric, at least, and even written policy is heading in positive directions in China, but to what degree that actually is enforced on the water is an open question. There had been, up until this story, I haven't heard this since then from the Chinese Foreign Ministry folks that I've been talking to, but there had been the claim that the government was unaware of the bad apple players that were out there in places they shouldn't be, engaged in IUU. The data was pretty resounding, and this was quite a sizable number of boats in clearly illegal waters, and that kind of claim became much harder to put forward once it was out there. But this is just one example of one place where the Chinese fishing fleet, or part of it, seems to be engaged in IUU activity.
Thank you, Ian, for really giving us a nice illustration of some of the issues that Philip and Tabitha have been talking about in actual an example, and this was really helpful to put everything into context. So just as a reminder, if any of the attendees have questions, please put them in the chat box and we'll get to them. But let me first start with a question for Tabitha. So we hear a range of estimates of the size of the Chinese fishing fleet and how many vessels they are. Could you explain how to think about the size of the Chinese fishing fleet, both on the high seas and in EEZs, and what the actual real footprint is?
Yeah, so I've seen numbers ranging from, people have talked about, there being like 3,000 distant water fishing vessels, and then people talk about, well, there's 800,000 Chinese fishing vessels, and so if you start to break down those numbers, it becomes a little clearer, like what's going on, where they're operating. So for all fishing vessels in China overall, there are 863,000, almost 864,000 total. But about 626,000 of those are inland vessels. And so some of those are engaging in capture, the capture industry inland, so freshwater capture. It's not very many. Most of them are actually aquaculture vessels. So that takes out a huge chunk of, the fleet. And then, so you've got about 238,000 marine fishing vessels. And then of those, there are some aquaculture vessels too, mariculture. So if you take those out, you have 156,000 marine capture vessels. And so that's kind of what we're interested in. And there's another about 10,000 helper vessels. And so of those, 100 and, let's see, is that the right number? Of those, I've got my statistics right here. So of those, a lot of them are, okay. So a lot of those are under 12 meters. So the ones that we're really interested in are the large and medium-sized ones. So the very large ones, which are over 24 meters, those are about 36,000. And so a lot of those are still fishing in China's EEZ. And so there was a report that came out recently by ODI. I don't know if you guys saw that estimated that China's distant water fishing vessels were 17,000. And so a lot of the confusion there is because China does not, so China has fisheries agreements with Korea, Japan, and until recently Vietnam, but they've let that expire. And that allowed for these joint fishing areas. So a lot of the Chinese fleet, are fishing in these joint areas. And some are actually, well, a lot are fishing illegally in Japan and Korea, but some are actually fishing legally in Korea. But if you're going by, according to international law, what China's EEZ is, That study looked at the vessels that were fishing outside of EEZ even once. But you have to keep in mind that a lot of those are staying in regional waters. So about 12,000 of those. So that report said that there were 17,000 distant water fishing vessels, but really 12,000 of those are just staying in the Yellow Sea, East China Sea, and South China Sea. And that's not to say that there aren't problems there. I mean, there's a huge amount of illegal fishing that's going on the part of the Chinese. But there's only about 3,000 vessels that are venturing beyond the Yellow Sea, East China Sea, and South China Sea and going on the high seas outside of the South China Sea and in the EEZs of other countries. And then beyond that, and then the Chinese treat that fleet separately too. So the subsidies that go to the domestic fleet, that includes, all those vessels in the Yellow Sea, East China Sea, and South China Sea. And they have their own subsidy programs. And then the distant water fleet receives separate subsidies. And beyond that, there's another about 1,000. That report did find that there's another about 1,000 vessels that have been reflagged to other countries, and so are being used through like a joint venture, wholly, or just reflagged to other countries. So there's, if you add that all up, there's about 4,000 that are, going all over the oceans and engaging in the kind of distant water fishing practices that we were describing. So I hope that adds some clarity, and I'm happy to follow up with all these numbers. I actually want to write something about this to explain it all. So,
thank you. I think, as we've heard, there's a lot of murkiness in the Chinese fishing numbers, and that just explains of just trying to figure out how many vessels there are is another rabbit hole to go down. So, to Philip, do you see are the top policy reforms that you would recommend to improve the behavior of the China's distant water fishing fleet and its and sustainability?
Yes, good question, Beth. In my presentation, I went through a lot of different issues, but if we could address maybe top three, one, I would really look at the subsidies that are being provided that allow these vessels to fish in distant waters. As we noted, many of these operations really aren't profitable without subsidies. And so really getting clear information about the subsidy allocations in the country and the data around them is really important. And then really pushing for reforms. I don't know, many of you probably know there's currently ongoing WTO fishing subsidies negotiations. And supposed to be by the end of the year that the WTO comes to a negotiated agreement around that. So, we have our U.S. representatives there pushing for reform. So if we can really tackle the subsidies issues and not allow them to provide money to harmful fishing, that would be hugely significant. Secondly is we've mentioned the satellite tracking, which governments with their vessels often use what's called a vessel monitoring system. And for the public, that groups like Global Fishing Watch track these vessels through what's called AIS, automatic identification systems. But if there was a mandate that these systems be turned on at all times, then there could be real accountability. So often these vessels, even in the Oceania Galapagos report, we saw that the AIS was turned on and turned off. So, if we can mandate that those be kept on, I think that would help enforcement and keeping to regulations quite a bit. And finally, these what we call fishing access agreements between countries, between China and a host country, they're incredibly murky. Usually you cannot find the details of what's going on there. And so there's no way to know if a good deal's been made. The citizens of the host country can't know, an international community doesn't know. So finding a way to reveal the details appropriately about those access agreements, I think, is also key. Thanks.
Thanks, Philip. And Caroline, I think that addressed your question in the chat. And then just one last question to Ian. And in case we lose some people right at 11, I just want to thank all those that attended. I hope you learned a lot about China's distant water fishing impacts in the oceans. But just to Ian, in what ways do you work with stakeholders like law enforcement, lawyers, or people attending this briefing today to get greater impact from the stories and the investigative reporting that you're doing on these issues on lawlessness on the high seas and beyond?
I feel like that question was written by me. It's why I left the Times, because I wanted to engage much more directly and actively in ensuring that these stories have impact, not crossing the journalistic line and becoming an advocate, but nonetheless interfacing in a more sustained way with academics, law enforcement, et cetera, lawmakers, and also bringing in those stakeholders and getting their help during the investigation, which is something that I was not really allowed to do as much at the Times, but I can do now and still publish in the Times. I'm always eager for allies and help, but I'm also really eager to talk with stakeholders even before the piece or pieces are published, but after they're done, so as to sort of debrief folks in a fair way, even folks that are going to get hit by the piece, and hear from them and give them a chance to think about how they might respond. I'm always open to work with all the stakeholders that are willing.
Thanks, Ian. And then we're getting to the end of our hour. So I want to thank the panelists for your time and your knowledge and expertise that you shared with the group today. And I'll pass it off to Jill in case she has any closing remarks.
Thank you. I think you really summed it up nicely. Just thank you all again. Thank you to everyone who was able to join today. Let's definitely all stay in touch about this. There's a lot of work to be done in this space, and today's briefing was very helpful to learn a lot, and there's certainly more to learn. So looking forward to working with everyone, and thanks again. Have a great rest of your Friday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.